You're listening to the Rural Remix podcast feed, your source for deeper, richer stories about life in rural places. Welcome to Living Traditions. I'm your host, Nicole Musgrave. Today's story takes us to Westel, Tennessee, home to fiddlemaker Gene Horner. For more than 70 years, Gene built instruments that traveled across the country, Carnegie Hall to California, the Grand Ole Opry to the Smithsonian. Two factors shaped Gene's fiddles. The first was his deep roots in the Cumberland Plateau. The second, his fascination with great Italian violin makers of the 17th and 18th centuries. Gene died this past January at age 91, an acknowledged master of his craft. Reporter Lisa Coffman interviewed him at his workshop in 2023. Recently, she attended his memorial service in Westel and brings us this story of how he came to be known as the Stradivari of the Cumberlands. All fiddle tunes in this piece are played on Gene Horner fiddles.
In 1951, Gene Horner arrived in Washington, D.C. He was 18, on leave from the Navy, and headed to his first museum ever. He'd come for fiddles.
The train station, you could see the Smithsonian, and I went over to look at fiddles, and boy, they got them there, you know.
Gene's obsession with fiddles had started a few years earlier at age 14. He'd found a broken fiddle in his grandfather's cabin in Westel, the cabin where Gene and his father before him were born. By the time Gene got that fiddle glued back together, he was hooked. 4 years later, he hoped the Smithsonian could help him figure out how fiddles were made. But that wasn't the case.
You see, I didn't know enough. I was looking at a forest, but I couldn't see the trees.
Months later, Gene was reading in his bunk on the Navy ship, and an advertisement in Popular Mechanics caught his eye: how to build a Stradivarius. He could order a manual for making a violin designed more than 200 years before by Antonio Stradivari, one of the world's greatest luthiers. Now is probably time to explain the difference between a fiddle and a violin. There isn't one. Not really. The difference lies in the way you string them, the kind of music you play on them. Or as Gene would later say, if I'm selling one to you, it's a violin. Violins cost more. In 1951, that Stradivarius manual offered details of fiddle making he'd hungered to understand.
I've always been a great believer in books. And when I seen that little book advertised, I just ordered it. They sent it to the ship, and I'd study that thing.
After the Navy, Gene came home to Westel, determined to make fiddles like that. Problem was, there was no one to teach him. So Gene kept reading. He read every book he could get his hands on about great European luthiers from centuries before. The Italian masters inspired Gene the most, especially Stradivari and his contemporary Giuseppe Guarneri. Gene pored over the details of their violins. Longtime friend and Grammy-winning fiddle player Kenny Sears says Gene had to rely on illustrations to learn his craft.
Gene was very self-educated. He didn't have a lot of formal education, but he read all the time. And he looked at pictures and he studied them.
And Gene began designing fiddles based on those pictures. He made his first fiddle the year he got out of the Navy. He said it left a lot to be desired.
I made one that year. It'd give you nightmares to look at it. But I was learning.
He just learned it the hard way, and he told me that he burned up a lot of fiddles in his wood stove in the shop. It just wouldn't, if they didn't suit him, he'd just make kindling out of them.
Making a living was tough in Westel, and Gene and his wife Ann had 3 children to raise. To pay the bills, Ann worked at a sewing factory in another town, while Gene put in 12-hour days making cabinets and studying fiddles on the side. Gene's son Bruce recalls what a long shot it was for his father to earn a living making fiddles.
Somebody making a fiddle in Westel? That's about as far out thing as you could think of to do around here.
But Gene kept at it. It was painstaking work, especially without a mentor or money to back him. He had to improvise. Gene built his own workshop out of wood from an abandoned hotel that he bought and demolished. He made his own luthier tools, gouges and finger planes and chisels. Bruce says his dad was self-reliant to the core.
I mean, that's what kind of man he was. He didn't, I don't know, it's just like you don't need money, you just need to be able to make something yourself.
In between building cabinets, Gene taught himself the ins and outs of fiddle making. He learned to carve scrolls, tuning pegs, all the delicate arching of a fiddle body. The work was not just demanding, it was unforgiving, as Kenny Sears points out.
There must be 1,000 things that has to be done to make one of these, from splitting the log to varnishing and rubbing it out. And if you just get one of them wrong, it ruins the whole thing.
In time, that hard work paid off. Gene's fiddles stopped going in the wood stove.
It took several of them, about 10, I guess, and lo and behold, I made one once. I've got it.
Gene was particular about the wood he used. The high-end violin world believed that you couldn't make a good violin from American wood. Gene disagreed. He knew the Cumberland Plateau forests and the loggers who worked there. And when their saws buzzed into a piece of curly maple fine enough for a Gene Horner fiddle, they called him. Longtime friend Mike Whitehead remembers Gene's close connection with local loggers.
He had special friends that would stop the sawmill operation long enough to roll that log off and move on to another one and call Gene, and he would come and sometimes buy the whole log.
Sometimes loggers would bring Gene into the forest to see a special tree they'd found.
So he knew the wood from the time it was a living tree until it was a finished instrument.
Gene made other instruments, mandolins and banjos, even a cello. But in his mind, fiddle was king. Word got out about how good his fiddles were. Professional musicians started finding their way to Westel. Kenny Sears remembers his first sight of the shop. He came with a former bandmate, and they were awed by all the fiddles.
We started tuning them up, and we play, I like this one over here, and I like this one over here, And we decided we'd never seen that many good fiddles in one place in our whole life.
One striking quality of Gene's fiddles was their balance. Clear and bright on the high notes, warm and rich on the low. It's a quality Kenny appreciates. Kenny's classically trained. He played with the Dallas Symphony Orchestra before his bluegrass career.
You don't get that low end out of a lot of fiddles, Usually when you get the low end is good, the high end is not. To get a balanced fiddle, Gene knew how to do that, and he did it very well.
By the 1970s, Gene was finally making instruments full-time. He wasn't getting rich. I make about a cornbread living off this, Gene liked to say. But in the years that followed, he gained recognition. Professionals toured with his instruments. Gene became a staple artist at Dollywood's annual Harvest Fair. And 3 decades after he saw that fine violin collection in the Smithsonian, Gene made it back to the museum himself, demonstrating his craft during their Folklife Festival. In 2009, he earned the Governor's Arts Award in Tennessee. Gene didn't slow down. He kept turning out fiddles, somewhere between 200 and 500 in his career. He never really kept count. Then in 2022, a major blow came. Gene lost his wife, Anne, who'd supported his dream of making fine instruments all those years. 2 years later, Gene's health began to fail too. He died in January 2025.
Just wanna thank you, Lord, for every time.
It's springtime in Westel, and the forsythia and redbuds are in full bloom. After a year of being mostly shuttered, Gene's shop is open again, this time for his memorial.
Always
close friends are gathered for one last round of music in the shop and to share memories of a man who changed their lives. They knew Gene as a master luthier and also as a generous teacher. Two of Gene's apprentices, Casey Meikle and Austin Derryberry, remember how they found their way to Gene's shop.
You know, I had heard of Gene before. I had never met him before, though. And so walking in here, it was just like walking into this magical land, you know?
Really stepping in here was kind of the spark to understand that people did this kind of thing for a living.
Over the next year, Gene mentored Casey and Austin. He'd show them a step, send them home, and teach them the next step when they were ready. They still laugh about a particular piece of advice he gave.
I think he said the first 10 or 20 that you make, you should probably just throw in the fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, he said after that, you'll be getting somewhere.
Austin went on to win the National Grandmaster Old Time Fiddling Championship, and he built more fiddles with Gene through a state arts program. Austin recalls being amazed at how, after almost 70 years of making fiddles, Gene's love of the craft never waned.
His body was obviously here, but his mind was always somewhere else. He was always thinking of the next fiddle.
Gene spent the last months of his life in a nursing home. His longtime friend Keith Williams remembers how Gene stayed focused on fiddles.
He said, I'd like to get back out the shop and make one more fiddle, he said.
And Gene stayed as obsessed as ever with Stradivarius violins. Sometimes Gene and Keith joked about what they'd do if they could get their hands on a real Stradivarius.
And I said, boy, I'd like to play that thing once. What'd you like to do, Gene? He said, I'd like to take my pocket knife and take a top off of it and see what's in the middle of that thing. Oh.
But here's the thing. During his career, Gene really did get to hold a Stradivarius. Just once. And no, he didn't take a knife to it. When Gene turned 70, his friend Kenny Sears took him to meet the concertmaster of the Nashville Symphony Orchestra. She had a Stradivarius on loan.
When she pulled it out, Gene's eyes lit up. He was like a kid in a candy store, you know, and he studied it for the longest time. I could just see he was recording every knife stroke.
Kenny had brought one of Gene's fiddles, too, and Gene got to hear his fiddle played next to a Stradivarius.
And when she played them back to back, they sounded the same. And when I played them back to back, they sounded the same. So he was making fiddles every bit as good as Stradivari.
Gene never forgot. Here he is after his 90th birthday in his busy, noisy shop, the last year it was open, still talking about that Stradivarius moment.
I think of it every day, how beautiful it was. The craftsmanship was just a perfection that a machine could never get. And yet, you could see little flaws around. One F-hole was set just a little higher. One side of the scroll was carved just a little lower, but it didn't take away from its beauty. And all 300 years of patina formed on it. And just think of the shiniest thing you can think of, and it would outdo it.
Now, at the memorial in his shop, Gene's friends honor him with music, playing tune after soaring tune. It's a fitting tribute to the man who became known as the Stradivari of the Cumberlands. For the Center for Rural Strategies and Living Traditions, I'm Lisa Coffman in Westel, Tennessee.
You've been listening to Living Traditions on the Rural Remix podcast feed. Music on today's episode is from Austin Derryberry, Casey Meikle, Kenny Sears, Mike Whitehead, and Keith and Minabelle Williams. Living Traditions is a production of the Center for Rural Strategies. Thanks for listening.